Alright, let's talk about grief, which can be a pretty difficult thing to discuss for a lot of reasons. One of which is that grief impacts us on a very personal, intimate, and sometimes profound level. Two, some of you probably have lost someone close to you very recently. Even if you haven't, even if the loss was a long time ago, it can still be as impacting today as it was back then. And third is that everybody experiences grief differently. So we have to make sure that we're acknowledging that while talking about some of the similarities. But we are going to start with some of the similarities, and these come to us from William Hoy's 5 death rituals associated with a funeral. Now again, death and grief are processed differently all over the world, but in many cultures there is some form of funeral, some form of the 5 things we're going to go through today. The first of that is significant symbols, and so a lot of times at funerals you will see flowers, you will see reminders of that person specifically. So it's the idea that a symbol can represent either the passing of that person or that person's life in general. Today, some people get tattoos, a symbol to remember someone they love. Other people will put a sticker somewhere on their car, but there's a lot of ways we can symbolize what someone means to us. Obviously, for me, music is a big one, and so especially in the class, we'll talk a lot about how songs can be significant symbols for people that we've lost. The second death ritual is gathered community. Again, we usually don't want to go through these things alone, and even if we aren't the most social, introverted people, then we can benefit from having other people around us. So we don't want to try to go through something like this alone. Talking to people can remind us that there are people still in our lives who love us very much, and it can also let us know that other people have gone through something similar. So one of the things we try to do when a loss has occurred is to come together. Everyone who knew that person will go to the funeral, and there'll also be things we can do like donate money for a charity that someone has been involved in, or even make food to bring to the family so they don't have to do something like that while they're trying to deal with the grief. So gather community can actually be important in a couple of different ways. The next is ritual action, and it's the idea of just doing something. A lot of times, someone may be lost in a very different or unique situation where if you're losing a lot of people you know in a combat situation or in a natural disaster, you maybe won't be able to take action for a while. For some folks, that's pretty frustrating because the loss can be so impacting, we need to do something to commemorate it. One of the very first clients I ever had sleep problems, she had anxiety, she had depression, and obviously there were a lot of reasons why, a lot of things that contributed to that. But one of the biggest was the loss of her grandfather at a very young age. She was very close to him, he was practically the one who raised her, but her immediate family thought that she was too young to process the funeral. So he passed away and she never really took any action on that. Well, as she was a counselor with us, we had her write a letter to her grandfather, everything she wanted to say, and then she had a little mini burial and little mini funeral for him on her own terms. And obviously there are very few things that are ever a magic bullet, but for her, she said that the very next night was the best sleep she ever had, and it was a way to do something to release the emotions of the loss. So that ritual action can be a very important part of that funeral process. The next is cultural heritage. So I've been to a couple of different funerals in my life, and depending on the family and the location of the family, the funerals were pretty different. At some funerals there was a large amount of singing, at other funerals it was more of a celebratory kind of a thing. So depending on the specific area you're talking about, there can be ways to not only acknowledge that shared culture, but to also pass it forward and to pass it on. So in some ways it's a way for us to come together, but in other ways it's a way for us to keep that person's memory alive by the traditions that we all share in that community. And then finally, the presence of the body is an important ritual for funerals. Now you may think that you don't actually need the body to go through everything we just talked about, and technically you don't. Oftentimes there is no body for whatever reason. Maybe again it was a tragic loss that involved a natural disaster, the body was never located, or maybe something was so horrible that the body just can't be present. And sometimes people will have difficulty with that. When people go missing and they are never able to solve what happened to the loved one, you often hear them talk about, if I could just find the body, if I could just bring her back or bring him back. Now they're aware the person is gone, but there is something about being able to say goodbye to the physical presence of that person that we still find very meaningful today. It's also probably a part of why we will place flowers at roadsides where an accident has taken place, or just commemorate the location where we last lost that person. So that physical presence can play a role in all this as well. So those are the 5 death rituals associated with funerals, and it's very important to make sure that you know all of them. The next thing I want to talk about related to grief is how we need to acknowledge its diversity. So sometimes we mean very well and we want to help someone who's dealing with a loss. So we'll think about how we would feel if that were us, and we'll say things from our perspective. But to best help the people we love, we have to make sure not to do that. We don't want to assume that their point of view is the same as ours. When my grandfather passed, I was dealing with it in my own way. He was the first person close to me I'd really lost. And I shared a different perspective on life and death from most of my family. But instead of asking me how I felt, a lot of people told me how I should feel and told me from their perspective, which A, didn't make me feel understood, and B, actually made me feel worse. So when we're trying to comfort someone, remember, it's about them. So it's not on us to say things that make us feel better, it's about what we can do to make that person feel better. And the way that you do that is to ask someone how they feel. Find out how they feel, what their perspective is on it. And then you can work with them from there. Especially if you're a counselor or you're in any kind of counseling situation, you want to make sure that you do that, because your job isn't to get that person to handle grief or the afterlife the way that you see fit. It's for you to help them do it within their own perspective. One of the best ways they can do that is through sharing, again, those symbols, sharing something that represents that loss or that person with them. A lot of research looks at how effective music can be in helping us deal with grief, but there's a couple of really cool studies that show that if we allow the person experiencing the loss to find a song and then to express it, that can be much more meaningful than us as just a therapist or a counselor or a friend providing a song. So one of my favorite studies looked at teenagers who were dealing with grief, and they were asked to pick a song that reflected their thoughts on the loss and on the afterlife, and there was a lot of variation in what they shared, but one of the coolest parts was how great they said they felt after sharing that it was cool to see that other people could relate to something so meaningful for them, and they just felt kind of a sense of pride and a sense of accomplishment for having expressed themselves in such an effective way. Again, when we're trying to help people or when we're dealing with grief, we don't always know what to say. So sometimes music can be a very powerful way to express our own emotions. The last thing I want to talk about are 2 positive outcomes we can take away from grief. Again, positive psychology is not pretending like bad stuff doesn't happen. It's acknowledging it, it's processing it, and then it's finding a way to move forward in the most positive and healthy way possible. And there's a couple of ways we can do that. One is to take that person's meaning and do something in terms of paying it forward. So some folks will start a charity or an organization that helps victims of an illness or victims of a specific type of assault, raising donations for that person's favorite cause. So you're literally taking action to make that person's life have some positivity moving forward. But we can also all take a look inward and make that person's loss meaningful by recognizing the fragility of our own lives and then making sure we maximize it. So just by realizing that any one of us could go at any second, and then by making sure you're living a life full of meaning and purpose and joy, you're honoring the person who you've lost, who's helped you remember that. So again, there's multiple ways. Not everybody has to go out and start a charity or donate money. Just you being affected by that loss and trying to be a positive person moving forward can be a perfectly great way to take away something positive from a very deep loss.